Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for making the time to be here. It feels like there's some kind of evil and suffering joke to be made about the Cleveland Browns, but I'll leave it to you to make the joke yourselves. Let me get my, oh, there it is, great. Cool. This is one of my favorite and least favorite topics to discuss. The question of whether or not it's reasonable to believe that God is good in spite of all the suffering and evil in the world. It's one of my favorites because I think it's very, very important. There's a lot of people who have intellectual questions, intellectual hurdles they need to overcome in order to take seriously the faith. And we, as Christians of all stripes, haven't always done a great job of articulating good answers to questions. And I think we do have good answers to the questions about whether or not belief in God's goodness is compatible with the horrors of the world. On the other hand, it's one of my least favorite things to talk about for a number of reasons. One of them, frankly, is because I've had a pretty comfortable life myself, and I feel like there's something unseemly about a person whose life has largely been pretty easy, talking about how suffering is not a compelling reason to doubt the goodness of God. And I sort of want to name that, own it, and I'm certainly not asking for additional suffering in my life, but I want to concede right from the get-go that I can't claim any unusually deep personal acquaintance. But the other thing is that this is a huge topic. It would be easy to spend a whole semester at a college or university just focused on this question of what is evil? How do we understand the relationship between God and evil? Is it reason to be an atheist? Are there good answers that Christians and other believers in God can give? It's so massive, and we're going to try to cover it. We've got about 40 or so minutes here, and it's a lot to do. So please bear with me. In fact, even when I'm doing this in kind of an introductory way, my standard spiel on the problem of evil ends up being about 3 hours of content. So I've cut out quite a lot, and in fact, this is the first time that I've done this in this more condensed format. So I may end up skipping over, I'm going to keep an eye on the clock, and I may end up skipping over some of what I prepared, and if you want to circle back to anything during the Q&A, you can certainly do that. But with all of that said by way of introduction, let me add a little bit more introduction, a little prolegomena. That's the stuff that comes first. And I want to emphasize, or I want to clarify what it is that I think philosophical reflection on the problem of evil, the question of evil, the relationship between God and evil, what they can do for us. Realistically, I think we can hope to answer this question here, and I hope folks can see that all right, but in boldface in the middle of the screen, the question is, why might God create a world in which things like this happen? That is, why would God create a world that has bad stuff in it? That's a question that I think philosophy can help us wrestle with and make some progress on. But notice what the question is not asking. It's not phrased in terms of, why would God let this particular horrible thing happen? I have a very good friend who a few years ago, his youngest son was killed in a completely unnecessary, awful accident. I won't go into all of the details, but suffice it to say, it was a horror. It was a tragedy. His son was 7 years old and got hit by a car and died. And it was just because a woman wasn't paying attention when she was pulling out of a parking lot onto Route 303 in Hudson. Utterly incomprehensible. And if the kind of question you have is, why did God let that happen to Vinnie Barron? I don't know. And I'm not going to pretend to know. And I'm very leery of anyone who insists that they do know the precise reason why that or any other particular horror, any other particular tragedy took place. But again, what I think the kind of philosophical reflection that I can offer you does help us with is it helps us see that though we know we live in a world where horrible stuff happens, that fact doesn't need to be a reason to call into question the goodness of God. That's what I think philosophy can do for us. Even if it isn't like if somebody's in the midst of tragedy, I don't think that the normal person wants a bunch of philosophical arguments about evil and suffering. Right? The image here on the screen is of Job's friends. If you know the story of the book of Job, you know they're kind of the bad guys. Job is, of course, famous for horrible, horrible suffering that God permits in his life for reasons unbeknownst to Job, though known to God. And Job's friends initially do okay. As the story goes, for several days they just sit with him in silence, which is often the best thing a person can do. But then, like so many of us, they feel compelled to start explaining to Job why he's suffering and trying to make sense out of where this came from. And that's when things sort of fall apart. But we rarely should be offering that sort of thing to our friends and loved ones who are suffering. But philosophical reflection is useful for the person. Perhaps you have loved ones. Perhaps you have parents or siblings or kids or friends or neighbors or other acquaintances who are maybe kind of sort of open to religion, but they don't think it makes sense. And one of the things that they wonder about, one of the things that doesn't make sense to them, is how you Christians can say that God is good when you look around at the world and there's all this bad stuff out there. Right? Now for that sort of person, I think that we can offer something. The other thing I want to flag right at the outset is a phrase I found helpful. Your mileage may vary. If you don't find it helpful, that's fine. But if you know the name Bishop Robert Barron, he's with Word on Fire Ministries, a very, very articulate and important voice in American Catholicism, a really thoughtful theologian and philosopher, and a great communicator. And he talks about philosophy bringing us up to the front edge of mystery. What does he mean by that? It means that when we're thinking about God, we need to be humble. We cannot understand the depths of who God is or what God is really like. When we think about things like the Trinity, when we think about things like the question of evil, it would be presumptuous, it would be audacious, it would be brazen to say, oh yeah, we've got that figured out, no problem. But what philosophy can do is, though we can't get to the back end of the mystery, we can't get all the way through it, we can get to the front edge. We can get to a place where we can at least sort of see the lie of the land. We can see the contours of, okay, I see how this actually may make sense, or even does make sense, even if we don't fully grasp it in the deepest possible way. So that's the intro. And I want to dive in. I'm going to give you a couple of reasons why I think God might allow evil to occur, and then talk about some limitations in our knowledge, and then we'll wrap up looking at Christian spirituality and the resources of our tradition in particular to help think well about suffering in the world. So the first reason why God might allow evil to occur, the first reason why God might create a world where bad stuff happens, is because that seems to be a necessary consequence of a world where genuine freedom is possible. You can imagine, and I don't want to be irreverent or anything in framing it this way, but imagine that God is deciding what kind of universe he wants to make. Right? Imagine a time when there is no creation, and that's all kinds of complicated philosophical puzzles are built into that statement I just made, but don't worry about that. Don't worry about the nature of time. If you imagine that God himself is deliberating, God's deciding what kind of universe am I going to make, there's basically three options. You can make a physical universe that has nothing alive in it at all. And that might be an interesting sort of universe to create that has stars and planets and things happening in it, but no life. He could create a universe that contains non-rational life, that is, one that has plants and some animals and whatnot, but no human beings or creatures like us. I should limit it to just humans, because God could create all kinds of rational beings if he wanted to. Or he could create a world, a universe, that has interpersonal beings in it. Beings that are capable of entering into relationship with each other and with him. And that seems to be a richer kind of universe for God to create. There's more in it. You can see why God might choose to bring something like that about. But even there's a further question about what kinds of interpersonal beings is he going to make? Is he going to make just like toys? Is he going to make robots that do whatever they're programmed to do? that don't make any meaningful choices, right? They can sort of move around like, gosh, I don't know if anybody remembers, 20, 30 years ago, there was a computer game called The Sims. Anybody remember this? Any hands on The Sims? I never actually played it, but I remember seeing it. If you never played it, don't worry about it. The idea was that you could create this virtual world on your computer, a town or a city or whatever it was, and there were these little, AI bots that would like interact with each other, but they weren't real people, right? They were just sort of computer programs bumping into each other in a computer simulation. They didn't have any real choices. That they just did whatever the program made them do. Well, God could create a universe like that. Or God could create a universe where the beings in it have genuine freedom. They can actually make choices that have significant consequences. They can choose for or against the good. They can choose for or against love itself, love himself. Well, if God's going to create a world that has the possibility of real love, of meaningful, freely chosen love, then it seems like one corollary of that is that God would have to allow for that freedom to be misused. So that might be one reason why God would create a universe where bad things happen. A second reason is to provide opportunities for what philosophers and theologians have sometimes called soul-making. The picture here is of St. Irenaeus of Lyon, a 3rd or 2nd century father of the faith. And St. Irenaeus and others who developed this kind of approach to the question have asked questions like this. What's really valuable in human life? What really matters? What's really important? Is the most important thing in life minimizing pain and maximizing pleasure? Or is there more to it than that? And most people seem pretty comfortable saying, well, that's certainly not all there is to life. There are other things. There, for example, the development of valuable character traits. I'm going to skip a quote here and move straight to this technical term. There are what are called second-order virtues. That's kind of not an everyday term, I suspect, for most folks. But the idea of a second-order virtue is it's a virtue, it's a good character trait that depends upon some first order, some more basic kind of challenge. What do I mean? Well, consider some examples here. Some examples like courage, compassion, mercy, and generosity. All of these are good things. In fact, they're among the best things. For a human being to live well is to cultivate traits like these. But what's necessary in order for someone to cultivate the virtue of courage? Well, there has to be danger. In a world where nothing is dangerous, where there's no risks, no one cultivates the virtue of courage. In the case of compassion, there has to be some kind of suffering. Right? No one can cultivate the virtue of compassion if there's no one to be compassionate toward. Mercy, generosity, you can see how the logic goes. The idea is that in order for these sorts of things to be possible, then God has to allow for at least some evil and suffering in the world to take place. That's the second one. Third, another reason, and here's C.S. Lewis, my great intellectual hero. A third reason why God might allow evil and suffering is to draw us to himself without overwhelming our freedom. Lewis has this famous line in his book, The Problem of Pain, where he says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. What does he mean by that? Well, look, if Christianity is true, if there really is a God, the greatest good for all of us, for every human being, the greatest possible fulfillment is to know God, is to be in right relationship with him. And how can that be brought about in a fallen world like ours? Well, if God is not going to completely override our ability to choose, then one reason why he might allow for suffering in the world is to put us in a position where we're forced to acknowledge that this world can't possibly be the fullest satisfaction of all our desires. There's got to be something more. There's got to be something else that speaks to our deep longings for goodness and beauty and truth and so on. I think he was an atheist, Aldous Huxley, has a line. He referred to man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. He was writing that in the 1940s, and it resonates even more 80 years later. Right? Man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. How many of us, even those of us who are practicing Christians, how many of us are constantly distracted by our cell phones, by TV, computers, all this stuff, all the noise of life. Well, sometimes suffering becomes the thing that God uses in a person's life to get their focus off of that stuff and on to questions of what really matters. What's life really about? What kind of universe do we really live in? So that's a third possible reason why God might allow suffering in the world. And a fourth one, here's C.S. Lewis's good friend J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings. And this is not an argument that Tolkien himself ever made, so far as I remember, but I think his writing illustrates this sort of idea. I think a fourth reason why God might allow horrible things to happen is for the sake of the story itself. If we think of God in creating the universe as kind of the author of a story, well, what makes a compelling story? Arguably, it's the existence of challenge, of suffering, and so on that has to be overcome, and then eventually is healed, is redeemed. So there's a great line, if you've never read the books, I'm sure you've at least heard of The Lord of the Rings. The second book in the series is called The Two Towers, and you probably can't read this long passage here, but I'll read it for you, don't worry. Tolkien writes, and if you do know the story, this is the character Sam Gamgee saying this. It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were, and sometimes you didn't want to know the end, because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you. That meant something, even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going because they were holding on to something. But there's some good in this world, and it's worth fighting for. We have to be careful with this, right? There's obviously a difference between what an author does with a fictional character and what God does in creating actual human beings with actual experiences and so on. But I think the analogy is still a helpful one, right? Why not, if you're Tolkien writing this story, why not just put the hobbits in the Shire and leave them there, right? Why is that not the story? Well, because there's something compelling, there's something beautiful, there's something dramatic about allowing the evil and suffering, allowing the characters to experience real risk, real loss, and then bringing it to fulfillment via redemption, via restoration, via healing, all of that. That's a beautiful and compelling story, and I think arguably, again, bearing in mind the difference between fictional characters and real human beings, even the opportunity, this is what's kind of captured in Sam's words to Frodo here, the opportunity to be a part of a story like that, to be one of the characters in a story that matters, that's a good thing, that's a valuable thing. And perhaps a fourth reason why a good and loving God might allow evil to occur. So that's the first part of what I want to share. 4 reasons why God might allow suffering and evil in the world. First, to make genuine freedom possible. Second, to provide opportunities for soul-making. Third, to draw us to himself. And fourth, for the sake of the story itself, which, and I'm going to return to this point, isn't over yet. That's a really, really important thing to bear in mind. That, again, I'll unpack more in just a second here. Okay, so then, having given 4 reasons why God might allow evil in the world in general, I want to point to 3 things that we don't know. 3 important things we don't know. 3 areas of ignorance of which we need to be conscious. The first thing is we don't know how much is too much. What do I mean by that? Well, look, what's usually called the problem of evil, I haven't used that language, I don't think yet, but for philosophers, if you're talking about reasons to believe in God or reasons to be an atheist, and you start thinking of different arguments, different kinds of reasons you would give to believe or to disbelieve, this question of why would God allow evil and suffering is usually pointed to as the strongest argument for atheism. And it's usually called the problem of evil. I sometimes, in philosophical contexts, as I have it on the screen here, I'll use the phrase, the atheistic argument from evil. With the idea being that the presence of evil and suffering is a compelling reason for some people to be an atheist. Well, the best version of that argument, the hardest one for the believer in God to respond to, is an argument that says, okay, yeah, I see what you said, with all the, free will, that does seem pretty good, and I can see why soul-making matters, I can see why God would allow some suffering, but some suffering. Not this much suffering. Look at the world. Look at what's happening in the Middle East. Look at what's happening in Ukraine. Look what's happened in the Holocaust and slavery in the United States and the Soviet Gulag. The horrors of this world. Yeah, sure, the atheist says, maybe a good and loving God could create a world with some pain and suffering in it, but not this much. There's too much evil in the world for a reasonable person to believe in God. That's a strong argument, but I think the retort that I'm gesturing at here is a really good one. Namely, how much is too much? If you imagine the story of planet Earth and you subtract the Holocaust, then you have a story, you have a history of Earth that's compatible with belief in a good God. What if you take out the Holocaust and you take out slavery? Is that world one where you can imagine a good God being in charge? And hopefully you see the point. It seems hopeless that we'd ever be able to point to a quantity of evil such that, okay, yeah, God could make all the imaginary worlds on this side of the line, but as soon as you cross, this much evil in the universe, then no longer is it reasonable to believe in God. I'm extremely skeptical of that sort of response, right? As I have it on the slide here, the prospects are bleak for a principled answer to the question, exactly how much suffering is compatible with rational belief in God. If the argument that the atheist is making is there's too much evil in the world for you, Christian, to be reasonable in believing God is good, then I think an appropriate response is, well, okay, how much evil would change that then? If the issue is there's too much, give me some sense for how much is reasonable. Hang on to that, because we're going to circle back to it in a minute. A second thing we don't know, and there's an important rule if you're ever doing serious academics, especially philosophy and theology above all. There's no reason to say something in straightforward English when there's a perfectly good Latin phrase that you can use instead. So let me say, we don't know what any particular instance of suffering looks like sub specie aeternitatis. What does that mean? That means we don't know what any particular instance of suffering looks like from the point of view of eternity, or from the perspective of eternity. Remember when I said that the fourth reason why God might allow evil and suffering is for the sake of the story which isn't over yet. The story's not over. It's understandable that when we look at evil and suffering, we look at the evil and suffering that takes place during our lives on earth. But if our faith is true, that's not the end of the story. There's more to it. There's more potential. There's more opportunity for things to be redeemed, to be healed, to be restored, that we simply haven't seen it. We don't have the whole picture. We don't even have the whole picture of our own lives. Think about a work of art. I mean, if you look at this impressionistic work here, that this is incoherent, right? That there is no apparent order or meaning. This is just what looks like a random series of dots. But this particular set of dots is just it's zooming in on this larger painting that if you're a fellow Gen Xer and you know the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off as intimately as you're required to, you may recognize this from Cameron going to Chicago. And anyway, I'm not going to digress and talk about Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Great movie though. But these dots, if you see the woman with the parasol there, with the little girl to the left of the woman with the parasol right in the center, that's the face of the little girl in the picture. Zoomed in, this is just an incoherent jumble of dots. You can't see any coherence, so it doesn't make sense. But zoomed out, from a broader perspective, from a different viewpoint, something that doesn't make any sense up close fits into a larger story. And this is something that probably most of us recognize in our own lives. I won't ask for concrete examples, but I bet that every person in this room, if you're looking back on your own life, you could probably think of at least one thing that was horrible, that you hated when you were going through it, that was awful and difficult, and that looking back now, you see how something good came out of it, how it brought about something worth having, even though in that time, perhaps you couldn't even imagine what that might be. And she wrote, "In light of heaven, the worst suffering on earth will be seen to be no more serious than one night in an inconvenient hotel." The perspective changes depending on, or excuse me, your take on something changes depending on your perspective on the thing. We do know, however, so something that we can say with confidence is that our own evaluative judgments, our own answers to questions like, how bad is this, how much is too much, and so on, those kinds of things are strongly affected by our own circumstances, by our own positioning. Think, for instance, of what counts as a big house? My wife and I, through the years, we've lived in a number of different places, and when I was in graduate school at Ohio State, we lived in a house that was about 100 years old down in Bexley, Ohio, one of the suburbs in Columbus. And it was a nice house. It was a normal house for that neighborhood, built, I think, in 1910 or 1920. And it just had the tiniest closets. And we were even, like, as a grad student with a young family, we couldn't fit all of our clothes because we had a 21st century American wardrobe. And like, look at houses that are built today for what are typically smaller families, right? But what counts as a big house? Well, it kind of depends on what century you live in, what country you live in, right? And what counts as a big house in America is very different from what counts as a big house in other parts of the world. Or one of my favorite examples, also from my time in graduate school, is this one, because I think this illustrates the problem really nicely, or the issue really nicely. This is a headline from the Columbus Dispatch from, what's the date on there? Oh, I can't quite read it. I think 2007, 2008. It was around the time I was finishing up my PhD. And I was reading the newspaper, and I saw this headline, and I was appalled. "Bedbug infestations on the rise, tough to stop." And I remember being horrified, being appalled, being outraged. I had a somewhat vivid memory of walking down Main Street in Bexley, and this was on my mind, and thinking something like, how can there be bedbugs? We live in America in the 21st century, right? Like, this is not a thing that we have to deal with. This is, right? And I started thinking about this, and about how, not that long ago, historically speaking, bedbugs are just part of life, right? I mean, you think of that old little bedtime poem, right? Good night, sleep tight, don't let the bedbugs bite, right? Like, where did that come from? Because people had like little critters living in their mattresses, and just part of life is that of course there's going to be bed bugs of one kind or another. Of course they're probably going to bite you, and yeah, you don't like it, but that's just part of life. Right? That perspective has changed. Then I started thinking about, if in 1850 everybody had bed bugs. I don't know if that's true, but I assume it is. Doesn't matter. 1700, whatever the year is when people were just constantly dealing with bed bugs. imagine an equal distance in the future, right? Imagine it's the year 2250, and human beings have somehow managed to eradicate mosquitoes, and without, jacking up the ecosystem or whatever else you have to, put in. Like, you can imagine somebody seeing a headline in the 2250 paper that says, mosquito infestation is on the rise, hard to stop. Right? And somebody having the same reaction, oh my God, mosquito, this is horrible, I've heard about mosquitoes. This is, in the 21st century, people used to, they would go out in their yard in the summer, and these bugs would, they would fly, and they had this horrible noise in your ear, and they had this, giant needle for a nose, and they would land on you and suck your blood, and then, you would have, these whelps would pop up, and people would be itching, and they would, you can see how somebody who had never had to encounter mosquitoes would look at our relationship with mosquitoes and be utterly appalled. Whereas from our point of view, as people who do deal with mosquitoes, nobody likes them, but it's kind of part of life. It's not that big a deal. Certainly if you're not dealing with malaria and things, I don't want to make light of that sort of stuff. But that's the point, and I sort of belabored this one because I think it's a little bit more complex to see, but it's really, really important. Again, if the atheist argument, if the issue is it's not reasonable to believe in God because there's so much evil in the world, well, hang on a second. Let's think about the limitations on our own knowledge and the fact that when we make statements like, here's how much evil and suffering is endurable, it's really heavily conditioned by our own experiences. I think that's undeniable, and that's the point here. Oh, there's a mosquito, sorry. All right, I haven't brought them up yet. A third thing is that we don't know what we don't know. And in particular, we don't know everything that there is to know about what's valuable. Philosophers who talk about this have used the term moral modesty to recommend a stance of humility toward this sort of question. Let me read you this phrase here, and then I'll unpack this a little bit. We don't know what genuine but unfamiliar values are included in the divine perspective. But we do know that our ability to recognize and appreciate what's really valuable matures as we grow. So here's another story for you. This one I'm borrowing from my professor, James Petrick at Ohio University. He wrote a little book on the problem of evil. He's a Catholic himself, and a really good man. And he tells a story that goes like this. I don't remember all the details of the specifics, but the gist of it is what's important. James grew up out west somewhere, and as his older brother was getting ready to go to college, he invited his little brother, James, to go on a camping trip with him that summer. And this was, I gather, whatever the age gap was, it was one of those where you get kind of like the hero worship. If you've ever had your own family or seen in others, when you have a 4 to 7 year gap between brothers, the little one often kind of sort of worships the older one. And whatever the magic number was, that's right where James and his older brother were. And so for him, he's maybe 11 years old or so, oh my gosh, I'm gonna go spend a week camping in the mountains with my brother. This is gonna be the greatest thing ever. We're gonna catch fish for all of our meals. We might see a bear. This is gonna be incredible and awesome. And he's looking forward to it. And then something happens. His older brother meets a girl, and suddenly he's not that interested in a camping trip. He's only got a few weeks left before college, and he would rather spend the time hanging out with his girlfriends. And James, at 10, 11, whatever exactly his age was at the time, this is incomprehensible. Who would pick that over that? Who would choose to sit with a girl when you could be camping in the mountains? That's obviously better. But then James got a couple years older. And suddenly, that actually makes sense to me now, right? Something that I could not understand as a younger boy makes total sense to me at 15, 16, 17, right? Things that we couldn't see when we were younger become apparent, see values that we hadn't seen before. It's even more dramatic, right, when you think of a very young child. Father Chris mentioned in the intro, I have 7 kids, so I've been through this kind of thing a couple of times. I mean, a toddler, a 2, 3-year-old, like, they don't get it. And as a parent, if you're a halfway, remotely decent parent, you're constantly doing stuff to your kid that they hate, right? Because there are things that are valuable and good that you appreciate, that you see, that you recognize, and they simply can't. Right? And then as they get older, they have the same, the circle of life keeps on going. They do the same things to their kids, and make them eat their vegetables and not play in the street and all those kinds of things. Well, if we see that happen over the development of our own lifetimes, from age 11 to 17, or from age 2 to 80, like, well, that gap is nothing compared to the gap between you and me on this side and God on the other. So we should expect that there are going to be some things that are a part of the divine perspective that are really richly good, and that we're just simply not in a position to know. So, those are 3 important things we don't know. How much evil is too much for a loving God to allow? Second, what any particular instance of suffering looks like from an eternal point of view. And third, what values are included in the divine perspective that we are not now, or perhaps ever, in a position to understand. That's the idea. Okay, and the last thing, I think we're doing okay on the time now. I might have estimated okay. Well, we'll see. I'll skip over this. The main thing I want to say is that everything we've said so far is really just kind of philosophical, in the sense that everything I've said so far, you can 100% affirm, even if you don't practice or believe in any religion. Oh, did we? Oh, we're
good.
Okay.
Keep talking.
Great.
Keep saying words.
Thanks. I'm glad you caught that. Everything I've said so far, you can totally embrace if you are Muslim or Jewish or anything else. You could be an agnostic. You might just sort of believe in some kind of God. You could say everything that I've said so far. What I want to do now in this last part of the talk is bring in some distinctively Christian ideas that I think offer an even stronger reply to the problem of evil. And I've titled this part, a 5th reason for God to be evil. That's the Felix culpa. And unless I miss my guess, probably about 70% of you are like, I have heard that phrase somewhere before. Anybody recall where you've heard the phrase Felix culpa? And if you're an ordained priest, you're not allowed to answer. It's part of the Easter Vigil liturgy. Right? Felix culpa means roughly happy fault, or fortunate fall. Even happy sin is a way you could translate it. What's the idea? In what sense? And it is referring, by the way, sorry, you can't see the picture, that's, or if you don't recognize it, that's a picture of Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden. The idea is that there's something happy about the fall of humanity, which sounds kind of bizarre, and yet here we have this phrase in our own Easter liturgy, like right at the heart of the church's year, saying, yeah, oh, blessed sin of Adam. What? Like, how can that be? Well, why? The reason is that only in a world where human beings, or some kind of creatures, have fallen, only in a world like that can there be an incarnation that then leads to an atonement. That's the only way you can get to an atonement, is to have a fall in the first place. There's no such thing as an atonement in an unfallen world. Well, then you might start thinking again about the sort of perspective that God has from eternity past as he's deliberating on what kind of universe to create. And what's been suggested, and I'm borrowing this from a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga. This image is in mine. It's from a short little cartoon somebody made. So if you're interested in this, you can find this on YouTube. But what he calls the value hypothesis. And he pictures this scale here, where he's like, okay, if God is deciding what kind of universe to create, well, what's the best thing there is? Plantinga argues, and I think as Christians, I don't see how we could not say this. The best thing there is in the universe is the incarnation of the atonement. Like, that's it, baby. Like, that's at the center of everything. That's the greatest good. And that's better than any universe that has God taking on a created nature in order to redeem that order from within. Any universe that has that plot element is ipso facto richer, more valuable, more beautiful than any universe that doesn't. And so therefore, if that's right, then God has another good reason to allow for the possibility of horrible evil and suffering, because those things come along with a fallen race. And those things make possible an incarnation that leads to an atonement. So there's a fifth reason why God might allow evil. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about Christian spirituality and the reality of evil in these last few minutes. There's a great line in the book of Hebrews where the author exhorts us to fix your eyes on Jesus. And I think in thinking about any aspect of the spiritual life, but certainly in thinking about the question of evil and suffering, always having in front of our eyes the person of Jesus Christ is absolutely the most helpful thing that we can do. And this is the closest I will come to any kind of personal advice for the individual who really is struggling with some particular instance of evil and suffering. Again, I can't, and I don't think anyone can answer the question, why did this horrible thing happen? But the one bit of practical advice that I think we can give is fix your eyes on Jesus. And recognize that ultimately everybody has to say something about evil. Every view of the world. It's not just Christians who have to deal with this. What are you going to do with evil and suffering? If you're a materialistic atheist, right, that is, if you're somebody who believes that ultimate reality is just physical stuff, and that's the end of it, well, what's your answer to the problem of evil there? Right? It's that, well, nothing's actually good or evil. There's just, some things happen that we like, and some things happen that we don't like. And if you get lucky, your life will have more things that you like than things you don't like. But ultimately, everything's just physics and chemistry anyway. Ultimately, all of your actions are determined. That's it. Islam, Stoicism, and I feel obliged to know, I'm not an expert on the religion of Islam, and this is simply my understanding of how Muslim philosophers have usually understood these issues. I could totally be wrong on this. But deterministic theological views that say, look, whatever happens is the will of God, and so you simply endure it, and that's the end of it. That's another way that some worldviews deal with it. Buddhism, and other views of that sort. And I suppose you could put some forms of Stoicism in here as well. The solution to suffering for the Buddhists is to cease desire. True enlightenment requires complete detachment, where you stop caring about things. You stop desiring. That's the solution to evil and suffering. Suffering is caused by the fact that we desire. If you never desired anything, on Buddhist thought, you would never suffer, because you would never have a desire that's unfulfilled. Christianity says, no, evil really is a violation of the way things ought to be. The world is a broken place. Something has gone wrong. And the God who is love redeems it through his own humiliation and suffering. This is another thing to think about. Everybody's got to do something about evil. And I would submit that if these are our main options, and I personally don't know of any other clearly distinct option from these, what I have four here, the Christian one is pretty compelling. This is something I can live with. This is something I can live into. And then last, or not quite last, penultimately, anybody okay to push a little bit past 8 o'clock? You guys all right here? All right, good. It'd be so weird if you actually shook your head no. Like, that would be so weird. No, sorry, buddy, it's time for you to wrap up. I'll go relatively quickly here, though, I promise. Suffering can bring intimacy with and solidarity with our fellow sufferers. This is something that Pope St. John Paul II elaborates on a bit in his Salvifica Dolores. as well as these ideas. And you hear masters of spiritual life talking about this sort of thing. This is another one where I'm trepidatious about entering these waters, because I certainly don't claim to be a great master of the spiritual life myself. But the idea that our own suffering can, in some meaningful way, be offered up and united to Christ. Right? That in our own sanctification, as we seek to become more like Him, as we seek to become more intimate with Him, that He can use our suffering in that way. That it can be offered up for other people. There's all kinds of remarkable stories about people who have offered their suffering for others and seen miraculous results. It's an extraordinary thing, and it seems to be a very real one. We can't look at the lives of those who have gone before us and expect that God will grant us easy and pain-free lives, but we can take solace from their example, and we can seek to meet God and love others in the midst of suffering. And then the last point I want to make, this relates to the last one, is to introduce one more technical term. There's a wonderful Catholic philosopher named Eleanor Stump, who teaches at St. Louis University. And she, I think that this is original with her. I think she was the first person to coin this term or point this out. But in the context of discussing evil and suffering and God, she uses the language of second-person knowledge. What's meant by that? Well, there's such a thing that the most familiar kind of knowledge, if you ever, I don't know if you guys sit around and think like, what is knowledge? What kinds of things constitute knowledge? Is knowledge merely justified true belief? What the most familiar sort of knowledge is what you might call third-person knowledge. And here, when I say second person, third person, first person, it means the same thing that you learned in like 6th grade grammar class. Right? First person is what? What's the first person in grammar? Me, I, good. Second person, you. Third person, good. He, she, it, they, all those. Good. Good work, everybody. All right. And that was also a test. We're past 8. You're still with me. So, third person knowledge is the stuff that we think of as objective, right? Everything we study in the hard sciences is third person knowledge. It's out there, right? It's in the world. We can both look at it, right? That door is made of wood. Is a third-person kind of claim. We can test it, study it, and so on. A little bit less obvious, but I think still pretty straightforward, is first-person knowledge. You have knowledge of your own self that other people can't have. So, like right now, I'm feeling thirsty and thinking I should grab that bottle of water that's behind me. Right? You can't have direct access. You can't have first-person knowledge of my thirst because it's mine. But maybe right now you're like, your first person knowledge is, boy, I do hope he ends soon, right? Or feeling like, this is kind of interesting, right? But you have first person knowledge of what's happening in you. Okay. Second person knowledge. What Eleanor Stump has argued is that one of the things that we learn from human relationships is that it's possible to know a person when we encounter them face to face. That there are things there's a kind of knowledge that can be acquired there. And it can be difficult to articulate, so I'll give you 2 quick examples here. One would be like in a truly loving relationship. And I'm very blessed to be in an extremely happy marriage. And my wife and I know each other very, very well. And I could imagine a scenario, and to be clear, my wife has never, ever been unfaithful. I can't imagine she ever would. But I can imagine a scenario where somebody suspects my wife is having an affair. And maybe they've even got evidence of it, right? Maybe they've seen pictures of her and some man who's not me, off by themselves somewhere. But maybe there's all kinds of third-person evidence of my wife's affair. And everything, like if you took it to court, the judge would say, I think she's guilty. But then imagine I look into my wife's eyes and she says, I've been faithful, I promise. Right? There's a kind of knowledge that's acquired there. Or to bring it closer to the kind of stuff that we're talking about here, think of children, especially young children, who need serious surgeries, often painful surgeries, and have a parent who has to take them to the hospital who has to take them to the doctor, to the surgeon, knowing it's going to hurt, and when it's a chronic condition where there's multiple surgeries, and the child knows just like going to the hospital, this is going to bring pain and suffering. And you can easily picture, perhaps some of you have experienced this in some form, where the child can't understand why the parent is doing this, and yet looking into the parent's eyes, the child can know you're loved. I love you. I care about you. Right? That's possible. Well, the idea then, in the context of, I'll give you the technical philosophical stuff that I've got here. A person may be rationally justified in believing in the goodness, faithfulness, trustworthiness of their beloved, even in the absence of compelling propositional, that is third-person evidence to support that belief. Second-person knowledge can give us a kind of knowledge of a person that we can't have in any other way. Likewise, a person who has genuinely encountered the God revealed in Jesus Christ really may possess knowledge of a sort that rationally defeats the atheistic argument for evil. And it's interesting to note that in the Scripture's greatest text on suffering, in the book of Job that we mentioned at the outset, at the very, very end, when Job finally has the chance to, air his grievances against God, and God gives this display of the wonders of creation, all this stuff, and it's, in various ways, most philosophers and theologians, that it's kind of unsatisfying. Like Job asks him, why did you do this? I thought you loved me. And then one way to read the story is that God is like, I did all these great things. Right? And people are like, but yeah, Job asked why this happened to him. Right? But there's a line that Eleanor Stump points to that I think is the key to unlocking so much that's so important. The very end of the book of Job, buried in this confrontation between Job and God himself, Job says, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. And it seems like that's what does it for Job. He actually encounters God, and though he's not given the kind of answer we would like to get, he's not given an answer that spells out, well, Job, here's why I let all this happen to you. Here's the reason why you suffered the way you did. What he gets is a glimpse of the face of God. And that apparently is enough. That if we actually encounter God, if we fall in love with Him, we come to know Him and trust Him and see His goodness the way I know and trust and love my wife, the way the child knows and trusts and loves his parent, and so on. That's the idea. So, 4 main claims then. There's a whole bunch of words on the side. You know what? We're past time. I'll put all this up. There's too many words. It's a lot. I didn't ask Teresa how big the screen would be, and I was worried this would happen. So I can leave this up here. You can take a look if you want, but that's just a summary of everything we've covered. That's everything I've got. We promised we have some time for Q&A. So yeah, thanks everybody so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
We're doing the papers.
Yeah, so if anyone has questions ready, just raise your hand, I'll grab them. Everyone else can kind of take a minute, ask any questions you might have.
If there's a question, I think it's supposed to be on paper.
It's supposed to be on paper, yes.
Yeah.
So if you can write down your question.
Well, it's a little complicated, so.
Use Latin.
Right.
Basically, my question is, does it help to differentiate the different kinds of suffering from things that we know and things that we don't know? So we know that God cannot commit evil. He cannot do something evil. So anytime He's brought about any suffering, either in our lives or in society, it's to get our attention and to get. We also know, on the other hand, that the devil loves you. And we know that the devil causes evil. So those are two kinds of evil that occur in our lives. Then there's a third, and that is natural catastrophes, volcanoes, and so on. that, oh, I'm sorry, and then the fourth is our own. We bring up about our own suffering from sinning and doing those things. So I can understand those three of the four. Natural suffering.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, excellent intuitions there, because usually when philosophers talk about this, they distinguish between what they call natural and moral evil. And that's exactly the distinction that you're pointing to, where, although you carved it into four parts, three of them are on one side of the line, right? Three of them you can point to some kind of moral agent that's responsible for it. Natural evil is more difficult, though it's encompassed by, in terms of what I already said here this evening, that soul-making theodicy is usually pointed to in that context, where the idea is that, well, no, God lets us be in a world where there are natural disasters, because that's where things like courage and compassion come into play. But there's more that can be said as well. I mean, the first thing I'll say is the least, as Father Chris mentioned in the introduction, I spent a lot of years in public higher education, and I never bring this point up in more public context, only because it makes people roll their eyes and they think that you're crazy, but I think as Christians it's something to take seriously. That is the potential role of spiritual forces in concert with natural disasters, right? I mean, if we believe that there really has to do with things that happened prior to the fall of Adam and Eve, prior to the fall of man. And the idea is, roughly, that unfallen human beings, because of their perfect, unbroken communion with God, had a kind of knowledge of the natural world. There's kind of two different ways this can be unpacked. One is to say they simply had a knowledge of the workings of the natural world, such that they could simply avoid the disasters, right? That they were simply aware of the kinds of, like, when a tornado was going to come or when there would be an earthquake. People were conscious of that and simply would be wise enough to move out of the way of those natural disasters. A somewhat more robust way that idea has been unpacked that I really find attractive, and I don't see anything, again, given the truth of our faith, I don't see why this couldn't or wouldn't be true, that unfallen human beings had indirect authority over creation, analogous to what the Lord himself demonstrates in the incarnation. So like when Jesus speaks to the water and waves and be able to still them. Some advocates of this sort of view have held that no, an unfallen human being would relate to the natural world in that same sort of way. Human beings are made to have dominion over the created order, and that in an unfallen world, I know if you've never heard this before, you're probably like, okay, this guy's just crazy. But I think if you think it through, it actually makes quite a lot of sense. That an unfallen human being in this physical universe, where there are things like tornadoes and whatnot, might perhaps simply be able to speak and still the waves, like Jesus did. So, and then the idea is that when sin is introduced to the world, when there's that rupture between God and man, we lose those preternatural powers and suffer the consequences as a result. Thanks for that.
You else have anything written down?
Why do we believe that there is moral evil in the world and not just a predisposition toward ignorance? That's a really interesting question. The main thing that I would be inclined to say is that we have to believe in moral evil if we believe in any kind of moral responsibility, right? If we believe that sometimes, that at least sometimes, we're responsible for the things that we do, we're culpable for the action we take. That is, if there is such a thing as sin, if there is such a thing as genuinely virtuous behavior, then that seems to commit us to belief in actual moral evils and not merely ignorance of the best way to behave. And I think it fits with our own experience of our actions. Right? I mean, there are certainly sometimes that all of us do things we wish we hadn't done. We do things that are bad, and we do them out of ignorance. That happens. Sometimes even in very serious ways. But there are also times when we do things that are bad, and we know they're bad, right? We choose them nonetheless. That's, I think, a pretty familiar part of the human experience. So that would be my take on that.
If anyone has any other questions, again, feel free to email them. If you can't find my email on our website, you can find me after, I can give it to you. And if our priests can't answer the question, then we can certainly send it along. So, good?
That's
Said a
very
lot of
good.
things, so.
So, thank you all for being here tonight. I appreciate it.
Again, we are so blessed in our diocese, and especially with our location here at Gates Mills, to be very close to a lot of subject experts in Catholicism, in philosophy, in theology. And so make sure that you kind of write down questions you might want to explore a little bit deeper, and we'll continue the series. So Dr. Burton, thank you so much for being here. So you can hand me your slips as you walk out. Pens, notebooks, those are all yours. So thanks for coming tonight, guys.